Hello, everyone. I am Hedgie, and this is my Tuesday afternoon stream, which seems is not the best idea of times, but I'm gonna go for it anyway. Um, I want to thank my mods, Andrew Mantis and uh, the only deaf guy, Connor, for showing up and being here to help me. I want to thank Summer Gemini 54 for also coming into stream. I will once again give a little rundown of who I am and what I do. My name is Hedgie, and I have written a cookbook called Cooking with Hedgepigs, and it is basically a memory book through food of family and good times, and it is both family recipes and recipes that I develop myself. And today we are going to be cooking what I call a hamburger stuffing casserole. Hi, checkout. Um, I will be cooking this. It's basically a comfort dish. It's kind of carb heavy, but when I developed it, hello Tazzy. When I developed it, I was thinking of the leftovers that we had in the house. I had to do something with hamburger. I had a lot of stuffing left over for Thanksgiving. Stuffing mixes, I should say, which is by that I mean bread cubes in a bag. I don't get them pre-seasoned. I don't like to rely on anybody else's seasonings other than my own. Um, and I thought, well, I developed a casserole. One of the things that happened when I married my husband, him being British, was that some of our American holidays didn't mean so much to him, like, for instance, Thanksgiving. And when we moved out on our own, moved to a different state, and no longer had family near us to share in the fun of a Thanksgiving holiday with the big stuffed turkey and all, was that making a big stuffed turkey for two people and all the side dishes, just a little bit labor intensive, and he didn't really appreciate it beyond the food anyway. So I made a batch of stuffing and I put cut up turkey breast in it and threw it in the oven, and then just made the gravy and side dishes, and it turned out to be so much easier with all of the same flavors that's pretty much my go-to now. But I was thinking, why can't I do that with beef? I should be able to do something like that with beef. Different vegetables, obviously. And so that's how this recipe came across. It is posted in my Discord. If someone will pop my Discord up there for people to look at, under stream recipes. And it's a little different than what I have. What I am doing is going to be a little bit different than what I actually have written down there. I wrote the version because most people seem to enjoy their stuffing with the vegetables all the way cooked through. My husband and I like a little bit of crunch, so I actually am going to be making this as I would for us, which is I put the vegetables in raw, and then they cook in the oven to a nice al dente version of themselves, so that we have a little bit of variation in texture between the meat, the vegetables, and the stuffing. They're not raw. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get the hamburger out of the container right now. So if you want to take a look at the recipe, go right ahead. This is, as usual, a pretty big recipe. It'll feed anywhere between 6 and probably 10, depending on your portion size and how many side dishes you want to add to it, just one vegetable or not. A nice salad goes well with it. Other things like cut up fresh vegetables also go very well with it. But I made it basically as a one dish meal. It's got the vegetables already in it, and all right, so to Start you off. The vegetables that we need to get in here, we need to cut up an onion, and I use a sweet onion for that. And sorry, you're not seeing what I'm doing, but that's so. Sweet onions are something that seem to be a United States thing for the most part. I have found Italian sweet onions, but they aren't really what my definition of a sweet onion is. A sweet onion basically is an onion that has been, well, first of all, it's a variety of onion, and second of all, they water them profusely to make a milder onion. A sweet onion at its best, for instance, the Walla Walla sweet onion that I'm familiar with because of the state I live in, which is Washington, where Walla Walla is. You have a big onion, first of all, and you can actually eat them like an apple. They are that mild in flavor. They are that sweet. If you need an onion that is sweet for something, like you are going to caramelize the onions to get the sweet flavor, if you start out with a sweet onion, you're already miles ahead because it has a higher mildness factor, I suppose we would say, to what the usual onion is. Walla Walla sweets also tend to be a bit bigger than a lot of the other kinds of sweets. You can find Mayan sweets and Vidalias, which is a southern onion, and they are smaller. Southerners will defend them to the death, as I will defend the Walla Walla sweet. So it's also kind of a regional thing. And yeah, that's Walla Walla, Washington, and it's used to be kind of a punchline in at least regional programs, just because I think it was fun to say Walla Walla, Washington. All right, so we have the onion here, and I am going to show you briefly. I mix these things up in a very large pan. It is large enough to make a potato salad in. It is large enough to put quite a few things in when you're doing them, if it's large batch like cookies or, a lot of pumpkin pies, anything that you might need. Now these are just dried bread cubes. I prefer the ones from Franz because they have a nice uniformity of size. And I use the unseasoned ones, as I said, because the unseasoned ones, I don't have to worry about what they put in them, and I really dislike having anybody determine my seasonings for me. That's two 13-ounce packages there, which is going to be quite a bit. And I will be adding things to this as we go along. So there we've got the stuffing in it. And I add quite a bit of veg to this. Like I said, this is kind of a one-shot holiday or comfort dish, like most casseroles are, basically. You generally see them served maybe with a side vegetable, depending on how much vegetable is in the casserole. Or, someone will just add a salad or eat it just as it is because it's already got a lot of vegetable in it. I start out with my onions. Now, the recipe that I put up says that once you have the diced onions and celery, combine them with butter and olive oil in a frying pan to sweat the onions out to a translucent state. And that will mean that when you finish cooking this in the oven, the onions and celery will be completely cooked through. There'll be a soft vegetable within it instead of having any leftover rigidity to it. It's not gonna have any crunch. So, but like I said, we like the crunch, so we leave it in. This is see faces? Yeah, I'm sorry. I am American. I don't think in Celsius. So while you're doing this, you will want to preheat your oven to 350 degrees. Uh, this goes together a lot easier than, for instance, a stuffed turkey, but it's still got its bits in prep to do. This calls for 1 whole onion. Obviously, add less onion if you don't like onion. If you do like onion and like a lot of it, add more. And actually, I don't cry when I cut onions. My cousin, her name's Tara, and I like to call us partners in culinary crime. When I taught her to cook, one of the things I started with was making soups. And we decided we were going to make French onion soup because, well, we really liked it. And we got a good deal from a butcher on a bunch of beef neck bones. And we made our own broth first, but the next thing we did is we got 20 pounds of sweet onions from the grocery store, and we spent hours running those onions through the mandolin. And oh yeah, cried plenty the first time, but that seems to have pretty much fried my response to it because I have yet to get watery eyes from any onion after that. So we did end up having to basically fumigate my cousin's house, though, because the onion smell was so strong, even days later, that it was it cooked through all of the furnishings, the carpeting. They had to. Yeah, it was fun getting that out, but we did it at her house, so at least it wasn't my problem. We did, however, have literally gallons of French onion soup left over, and perhaps someday I'll show you all how to do that. It's mostly a matter of starting with a good broth and breaking that down to spending enough time caramelizing the onions. You go far beyond having a translucent onion. They go past golden. They go all the way down to almost caramel colored. And what you're doing is caramelizing the sugars in the onion, so if you don't get it far enough, the soup's not going to taste right. So, how is everybody today? I hope everybody's doing well. I say as my stubby little nails try to deal with that. I have got pre-done celery stalks here. They're already cleaned, they're mostly trimmed, and I will finish trimming them up myself. And like I said, we like crunchier vegetables in this. We like a variation of texture. So I will cut these larger than I would normally cut them. And normally it would be a fairly fine dice, but when you're going for a texture of a vegetable, you tend to leave it in larger pieces. So it will take longer for it to cook, or celery and onion pretty much disappears. And what I'm doing here is just trimming off any bruised or dry ends to these. All right. So, normally I'd cut these into at least 4. These are just going to be cut in half for, like I said, a larger slice. And be very careful with your knife. I know that I'm not as impressive as a trained chef, but I don't cut myself, so that's always important. So we tried this recipe and thought it was pretty good. It's kind of reminiscent of a hot roast beef sandwich, um, without and for if no one knows what that is generally like leftover pot roast, um, with gravy on it, and you lay out a couple pieces of bread on a plate, and you layer that over the top of it and have it as a hot open face sandwich. And it's diner food, it's comfort food, it's a way of using up your um, leftovers, and that's often very important, especially in these days where people just can't afford to throw food out. I mean, they've never been able to afford throwing food out, but especially now with COVID, it seems to be a much more thrifty environment. People try to use up what they can, use the most of their, produce, use the most of their meat so that nothing goes to waste. And hi, Frumpy. Let's see. I know that some of my viewers have actually been suffering from COVID, and I'm glad to see them out and about, and hope they are doing much better. And let's see. In my family, we've often, had the time and money to have your picture perfect plates, get 8 ounces or 12 ounces of steak, have mashed potatoes or a baked potato, a salad, a couple vegetables. But when I was growing up, it was a bit different, and it was always a bit different with my grandmother who taught me to cook, and this was my paternal grandmother. We called her Grandma Twitchell. And she was an interesting woman. She was raised in railroad towns. Her father put the railroad in from New York through Washington. They traveled actually in a covered wagon for a while. I mean, there weren't really roads that went the whole way, and they had to get there. And my great-grandfather and his 3 sons worked for the railroad, putting, leveling the area for the track, putting the track down. And she grew up in these little towns with mixed immigrants and shacks, basically. So food was a lot more filling back then. They relied heavily on carbs, they relied heavily on meats, and things like casseroles and meals like that really would both stretch a budget, and they'd stick with you, which was the important thing, especially when what you're doing all day is hard physical labor. And that was actually where she met my grandfather, who also worked for the railroad, but he was an engineer. He actually ran the trains, and he met Grandma, and 2 weeks later they eloped and got married, and they stayed together. They never had a night apart until he died back in 1992. And she never really changed how she cooked. She did the same old country cooking she was taught by her mother and by her grandmother. And so there were things. They didn't have grocery stores so much back then, and so there were gardens that were put in. They had field fresh lettuce, and they grew their own celery, and they grew their own tomatoes and beans, and that was a large portion of what made up their meals, along with spaghetti was not something that they did, but noodle casseroles like tuna casserole, or whatever the leftovers were thrown together, and some sort of sauce was put over it. usually a gravy type, and then cooked in the oven. Provided lots of food for everybody. Leftovers, they could have some for their lunch the next day, and that would be what they would eat. It's stick to you food. And a lot of the recipes never were written down because a lot of casseroles in particular were just a result of let's throw together what our leftovers are and cook them. So let me see, I've got mushrooms here somewhere. There they are. I love mushrooms. Mushrooms are lovely things, and varieties taste different. If you have a brown mushroom, or as they call them, a cremini, it's actually a baby portobello mushroom, and they have a very earthy and they have a very beefy, actually, flavor to them. If you pair these with beef, you will get a stronger flavor of beef in whatever it is you're cooking. If that's a pasta, if that is a spaghetti sauce or manicotti, if you put them into, for instance, the sandwich that I made on Saturday. That had baby portobellos in it too, which of course, like I said, it strengthens the beef flavor in anything, which was good when I was a vegetarian because I wasn't really prepared to go without beef forever, and it really helped to be able to put these into the food. Plus they're just a wonderful flavor in general. A lot of people don't like the texture of mushrooms, but it's not so much a texture issue. It's a texture issue, not the flavor. Pardon me. I've heard lots of people say they really like the flavor. I am making hamburger stuffing casserole, and the recipe for that is up in my Discord, and that is under the section called Stream Recipes. And you'll find the recipe for the sandwich from last week, and you will find the recipe for this hamburger stuffing today. As I mentioned, I am diverging slightly off of it. We prefer to have a slightly crunchy vegetable, so I am not sweating down the onions first like I have in the recipe. I'm just entering the vegetables into the dish without that. And I'm just quartering these portobellos. And I am going to turn on I have an electric frying pan here next to me, and I'm going to get 2.5 pounds of hamburger started cooking. And that is going to be browned until it is no longer pink in the middle anywhere. And that is, well, good food safety, but you don't want to chop this up really small. You want to have the pieces of hamburger be almost like a meatball, so that you have a mouthful of meat. You have a good bite of meat when you take a bite of this. After I am done cutting up the mushrooms and adding them, I will move the cutting board out of the way so you can watch me work with the beef. So to run through what I've done so far, I have taken 2 containers of 2 13-ounce plain bread cubes from Franz. Could be anybody. They actually, around Thanksgiving in particular, in the grocery stores sell bags of just plain bread cubes, and those are perfect. I have in the past made my own bread cubes, but that's a lot of work for not a lot of gain. So it's just easier to start out with your own um, pre-done. And if you want to get seasoned bread cubes, go right ahead. But I tend to season everything with my own. So yeah, Helen, I know we've talked about it before that you like the flavor of mushrooms, but not so much the texture, and that's pretty common. They do have a slightly rubbery texture, and it's just one of those bits and odds that separate everybody. Right, you don't mind the texture, Frumpy, but they just taste like dirt. Well, they are grown in the dirt, and mushrooms are often described as having a very earthy texture, earthy flavor, and that's pretty much what they mean when they say that it is a mineral flavor, and that is what you get when you're talking about some of the vegetables like that. I personally absolutely adore them and always have. So this is putting 16 ounces of mushrooms in with 2.5 pounds of hamburger. You can make it a little more, a little less. I like to have a pretty good mix of meat to bread in this because it is, after all, what you're going to be feeding as a whole to your family, not just this is a side dish like stuffing often is to people. One of the other things you will see coming up in this is the recipe calls for your choice of vegetables. You could either just leave it as it is and not add vegetables in, or you can add in your favorite vegetable. Green beans, you could add in, I chose broccoli this time because we didn't have cauliflower. Cauliflower goes very well in this too. You just clean the florets out, make them a reasonable size, and mix them in with this. So it's all a one-pot meal that gets covered in yummy gravy and gobbled down, basically. Hello, Waffle Mouse. How are you today? Welcome in. I have got, I don't know if you can hear it, but I have got 2.5 pounds of hamburger that is searing off to the side. You could do it in an oven, put it in a pan, portion it up basically and put it in an oven. Or you could just, do it in a frying pan like I am. The most important thing is you don't want to add that raw to this. Just not a good idea, especially when you're talking about hamburger. Alternatives to this, you could, if you have that leftover roast, you could use chopped up roast for this, and it would go very well. Bring a different dynamic to it as well because it is a meat with the muscle fiber intact versus a ground meat. Okay, almost done with the mushrooms. I'm going to call that good for the mushrooms. And get my board out of the way now. Okay, so as you see here, I've got this giant bowl that is full of breadcrumbs and onions and celery at this point, and you can see why I mix it up in a big bowl because, well, it's a lot of food to put together. This is cooked in a full-size turkey roasting pan, if that gives you an idea of how much this actually makes. This is just to do a little bit of a premix. You can use your hands, you can use a spoon if you like. One of the best tools in a kitchen is your hands, so bear that in mind. Nothing wrong with that as long as you keep washing your hands between things. Alright, I am going to bring over the skillet so you can see it now. And this is just an electric frying pan. And you will also be seeing me make the gravy for this in it. And you want to keep this in as big a chunks as possible because it will break up anyway when you're mixing it up. But it's really a much nicer recipe if you have chunks of meat in it rather than ground up meat kibble. And I will probably be varying the weekday times for the show. Not a lot of people can get in here at noon on a weekday in America. They're out working. Although I know it's evening for my European viewers. So what does everybody prefer when they're eating something like a casserole? Would they rather have something that's a ground meat? Would they rather use leftovers? Would they rather actually have the texture of the beef fibers being intact instead of ground up? It does smell good. This is just right now plain beef, and I need to remedy that. You want to layer your spices all through the dish so that you are using every bit of it seasoned. You don't want to have something be unseasoned so that you go from having a nice seasoned bite of food to something that just tastes bland and boring. So multiple layerings. We will be putting seasonings in both the meat, and this is sage. It's ground sage, and I just add a sprinkling of it over it. That's roughly about half a teaspoon. I have got one of my favorite devices ever. It is a rosemary grinder, and it works like a pepper grinder basically, and it breaks up the dried rosemary, and it activates the rosemary oil that remains within that dried product. And then I add in my parsley, which I absolutely adore. Parsley is incredibly good for you. It's high in iron, so if you have some sort of difficulty getting iron in your diet, try using parsley in what it is that you're cooking. Add it to your soups, add it to your meats, and it will help you get more of the protein, the iron that you need in your diet. Especially important for women. Yeah, Twitch does need a way that we can have people sample this, and smell-o-vision would be awesome. Maybe something like a scratch and sniff on the screen. I think they would have a little bit of screen damage in that case, but it's okay. All right, this is nearly to the done position here. As you can see, I did leave larger pieces where I could. And I do believe, yeah, the pink's gone. So I will now take this, ow, off screen, ow. I may have to change my plan for cooking the gravy. I was going to do it in that skillet, but the probe for it is really hot, and that makes me worry a bit. Now I am taking the meat out and just putting it over the top of this. I don't know how people make stuffing, if they make stuffing in the family. Some people use cornbread stuffing, some people use sage. I really love the flavor of sage, so sage is in a lot of my dishes, especially the gravy, both Thanksgiving gravy and stuffing, and basically any of the other times I make it, it's a sage stuffing. This is the family's recipe basically for stuffing if you take out the hamburger and the mushrooms and the other vegetables. It's just celery and onions sweated down and added to a dried bread cube and then moistened with a broth of some flavor. And one of the things you need to make sure of when you are making that stuffing, when you're adding the broth to it, so you need to make sure you don't soak the bread, or what you have is more like a bread pudding versus a stuffing, and I'll show you what I mean when I do it. All right. See what I mean? That's really hot. Okay, now, because this is not for me, I'm using boxed beef broth. And it actually says it doesn't contain, there is no garlic in it, but I always like to be very careful. So if it's something that I'm going to eat, it's going to be a broth that I made rather than a boxed one. All right. One of my favorite implements of the kitchen is the spoonchula. It is a cross between a spatula and a spoon, and it works very well at mixing things up. I thought I had one of these that was open already, but okay. So this calls for roughly 64 ounces of broth. You just want to make sure, because sometimes the little devils just don't seem to soak up enough of the juice, and you don't absorb it well enough. Now, as you saw, I poured that over the entire container here, and now you want to just start mixing it up, both so that the ingredients are well combined and also so that you have a chance to get all of the bread cubes moistened. And I say moistened rather than wet, because you want to have the edges of the bread cubes starting to crumble from the juices, but you still want to be able to have, when you look at the bread cubes, and they're not there yet, but this one is kind of close. You can see, maybe it seems to be having a hard time focusing on it. Well, the edges are crumbling, but when you pinch it, it still has resistance to it. It still has a crumbly, bread cubey, crouton-y texture in the middle, and that's what you're looking for. Anything more than that, you're going to have a very, very wet stuffing, which is not what I go for. And for this, you just basically lift and heap it into the middle as you go around, and it will gradually mix most things in. I wish my food was more photogenic, but my food tastes better, and brown is pretty much the flavor of my food. It is more of a home cook rather than a pretty meal. So, all right. Now, as I said, I was going to add a couple cups of vegetable, and in this case, it is broccoli. And I don't know why, but no matter what size the container is that I cook in, whatever one I choose to cook in, it always ends up this way. I fill it to the very top without meaning to, and it's just the way it is. I'm going to add a little bit more broth to this. And I am going to add in more seasonings. So over the top of this, I am adding in probably another half teaspoon of sage. I don't need to add more rosemary because rosemary is fairly powerful the way it is. And it is something that you can grind it in a vegetable, or, like a coffee grinder or a grinder for a mortar and pestle. If you don't get the pieces small enough, you tend to have this little crunchy stick in what it is you're eating. So that is also one big benefit of using a fresh herb over a dried herb. But dried herbs are really much more convenient. Nothing against fresh. Fresh is good. Fresh is better. But it is also something that a lot of people don't have the ability to keep around in their house for long lengths of time. So that's why it's popular to use dried herbs over fresh. Let's see now. I'm trying to keep this under the camera. All right. Now, as I said, this uses a full-size roasting pan. And I need my kitchen elf out here if he would be so kind. Honey, can I get you to come out here and help? This is the pan here that we're getting, and it is big enough for a full-size roasting turkey. And just start tipping it. And this will fairly efficiently use the entire container. You should have been heating your oven to 350 degrees. That's a nice hot oven without being too incredibly hot. And you can fit about a 16 to 20 pound turkey in this roaster. But in this case, we're filling it up with the stuffing casserole. And at this point, you want to add you want to put a top over it of aluminum foil. Is there anybody here that has any questions so far? Have you found my Discord? There doesn't seem to be any questions, at least that I can see on my screen, which is fine. We have got this casserole here. I've done some movie magic. Basically, I already made one of these today. And when this goes out of here to go into the oven, I'll start making gravy. The second one, the first one I should say, is actually already cooked and ready to go. So, let me think. Upcoming on stream, yeah, I've been kind of carb heavy these first two recipes. I am going to make a baked omelet, a baked cheeseburger omelet specifically for Saturday's stream. And that's an interesting one to do. You basically, instead of having to hover over your eggs in a pan and make them look all pretty, these are actually baked. It's almost more like a quiche, but without a crust. And you can do it with a lot of different ingredients. I'm choosing to make a mushroom cheeseburger omelet, and I found it was a really good way of using the leftovers that you have. For instance, if you made a whole bunch of meat for spaghetti, but you didn't need all of the hamburger that you made, you can put that in there or cook some special for it. If you have leftover taco meat, you can put the taco meat in there instead and turn it into a taco omelet. So, I'm going to turn the heat on under this thing again, just enough to get it simmering. And as I said, I do like to season everything, especially as my mother, my husband and I caretake my parents. And my mother is on a very restricted sodium diet, so a lot of things that you would get flavor out of are sodium. And she can't have that, so we raise the spices in other ways. We raise the flavor by using herbs and fresher ingredients when we can, and just make sure that it's as flavorful as possible. Okay. Now, I'm surprised nobody has asked me what a pigloo is, for instance. Now, I have actually owned 3 hedgehogs, and they have a little home that you buy them that they like to sleep in. They are basically burrowing creatures, so they want to be somewhere that is safe for them. They feel safe. And it looks basically like a little plastic igloo, and you can buy them for mice, and you can buy them for hamsters and guinea pigs. You can even buy them big enough for ferrets. But they're called pigloos. And it sort of became a joke when I would, scamper off to another room or, figuratively hide. We would say that I was, as Hedgepig, was running to the pigloo. So that's how we got the name Pigloo for where it is that I have my Discord. It's called the Pigloo. It's a safe place. And I do want to stress that, actually. My stream is a safe place. My Discord is a safe place. I don't put up with any kind of hate speech. We don't allow bullying. You need a place where you can find acceptance, and you're going to find that here. If anything happens, I've got my mods here. They will step in, and any kind of distracting, violating presence will be removed. They won't stay here for very long. Yes, and my husband Andrew likes banning people. It is kind of fun. All right, to turn this up a bit more so it continues to heat. And this is one of my little friends. This is Pink Pig. Pink Pig has a happy little smile. She wears a pretty pink tutu, and she has a little bow over her ear. It is one of the presents my husband has given me over the years. That Pink Pig is just something to encourage me to smile. And how could you not smile looking at that little face? All right. Now, as I said, you want to add extra vegetables to your casserole, and I did not give you specifics, just suggestions. And anything that would taste good with beef and good with gravy, you can put in there, like I said. Green beans, peas, corn. You probably add carrots in there if you like those cooked, which I actually don't. Love them raw, hate them when it's cooked. And broccoli, cauliflower, both of those would be really good. And if you don't have the time to make gravy, you can get like a brown gravy mix and put it together and use it when you make this. It's certainly less labor intensive than actually making gravy. All right. I need to stretch off to the side now, where my supply table is, and get out some water, and get out my big container of flour. And this is basically a 32 ounce container plus, so that's 4 cups. This is about 6 cups of broth in this, and you'll need about a half a cup of flour. And you want to match that with the amount of water that you put in it, because what you're doing is you're making a flour slurry, and that will cook in the gravy and thicken it and turn it from broth to gravy. Yeah, by stretch I do mean using my tiny little T-Rex arms. I'm not exactly a small person. I am actually 5'8", but when you're comparing that to someone who is 6'3", like my husband is, much longer arms. All right, and so I have about half a cup of water and a half a cup of flour, and I am whisking it up so that we don't start out with any flour lumps. It's always easier to start out without the flour lumps. And if you do end up with lumps, that's no big deal. You can, if you have a stick blender, if you have a regular blender, you can put the gravy into that carefully, because once it's hot, it will behave differently than cold liquids in a blender. But making sure that you have the flour pre-unlumped is very important. Now, I raised the heat in this. I'm going to lower it now that it's actually come to a simmer. Once you start adding a thickener to a broth, you want to continually whisk, or you'll end up with dumplings. And that is just a fact. So, and as you see, when it starts out, it's very milky in color. That is because the flour is raw. It is, if you tasted this now, it would taste like flour. and that's not a good thing. You want to have this clarify a bit. It's not going to get really clear like you would with a cornstarch or an arrowroot, which are both other thickeners you could add to this, especially if you have problems with wheat. Um, but it will clarify somewhat, and you go first of all by the color, see what it looks like, and when you start seeing it actually thicken, at that point you will want to taste it to see whether or not that floury taste has cooked out. If it still tastes like flour, it's not done yet, no matter how thick it is. In which case you add in extra water a little bit at a time and continue cooking and stirring until the gravy is nice and thick and cooked clean through. So, yeah, Andrew likes the Andrew likes the electric whisk, as he calls it, which is actually our stick blender. He likes the outboard motor sound, and well, who can blame him? It's a very manly sound. This is going to I don't believe I answered what happens. So when you get your casserole put together, you cover it in tin foil and you place it in a 350-degree oven for 1 hour. And about 15 minutes from the end of that, if you like to have a crispier edges to your stuffing, you would remove the aluminum foil, and at that point put it back in the oven for the last 15 minutes to add a little bit of a crisp to the top. Now, hopefully you can see here, I can see it, but maybe you can't. You can see that the gravy is starting to turn color. It is now starting to get a deeper brown in little tides across this, and that is where the flour is cooked. And so you just keep mixing and it will eventually all turn that color. And as for the thickness of the gravy, that's really up to you. Something to bear in mind is that if you are going to refrigerate this gravy, it will continue to thicken. And when you reheat it, probably in the microwave, possibly in a saucepan on the stovetop, you need to add a little bit more water to it and whisk it back up so that the lumps are gone, because it will solidify almost like a pudding. And you want to make sure that when it's done reheating, it's once again a nice smooth gravy for you. All right. So at this point, and I have to apologize, I am very blind. We're a little bit over an hour in. You would not normally be making your gravy at this point, but probably working on side dishes, putting together a nice salad with your lettuce of your choice, maybe grate some carrot, add chopped up cheese, some tomatoes, whatever it is you like in your salad. Possibly making mashed potatoes, depending on how carb heavy you want this to be. It is certainly a lovely thing to also drench your entire plate in gravy, so that's definitely an option. And this is still, it hasn't really thickened at all. So, and if you find out that the amount of flour and water that you added to something to start thickening it isn't quite enough, there's nothing wrong with mixing up another batch, maybe half as much. So if you started out with half a cup of flour, do a quarter cup the next time. And you can see my little ring light here reflecting in the gravy, which is kind of cool. Pardon me while I take a drink of milk. I am going to let this continue to cook for a bit, and I am probably going to add in some more thickener because it looks like I need some. So, as I said, you want to keep your gravy at a simmer if you can. That's not a rolling boil. You're not going to see bubbles everywhere. It's just a few bubbles here and there, and that is what you will want to keep active the entire time you are cooking it, or the cooking process will stop. It'll stay warm, but it won't continue to cook. So I have added some more flour. I'm adding in an equal amount of water. And it makes a fairly thick slurry, not a bad thing. Once again, here's our flour and water. I'm being fancy and using a fork. I did it the first time, I might as well continue. And you whisk it up until you don't have any lumps anymore. And now we turn back, we get the whisk out, and we start pouring in the new batch of the slurry. And you just keep it mixing in so that, as I said, you don't end up with dumplings. And as you can see, I think you can see now better the differences in color here. It's got little tides and streamers of darker brown where the flour was cooked, but it just wasn't enough to thicken the amount of liquid I had in here. And I think you can see now that it is actually starting to thicken. It's a change in viscosity, basically, of your liquid. Something that you can see, especially if you test this with a spoon. And you can see that it actually does, it's starting to stick to the spoon a little bit. And that's what you want to have for a gravy. Okay. Cooking times always vary. It's like it would be nice to have things cooperate, but well, they tend not to. It's a balancing act anytime you put any meal together. This is going to be done very soon. And let's enjoy the banjo here. This music is brought to us by royalty free, which means nobody's going to get DMCA'd, no one's going to get upset about it, and it gives us a little bit more than just my voice droning on as I babble at you all. Banjo time! I grew up every summer from 10 years to 18 years on the farm with my grandmother, and this was a small cattle ranch. It was only about 40 acres, but she had about 5 acres of that in a garden. So I got to spend my summers weeding the garden, and I always hated the weeding the garden because 5 acres is a lot to weed. However, the produce that came out of that has spoiled me forever for store-bought produce. She always put in about 2 acres of sweet corn, And there is nothing better than sweet corn on the cob that was there growing an hour before. She always put in a lot of tomatoes, and the tomatoes were ripened on the vine, so gorgeous big red tomatoes, sweet and still warm from the sun usually by the time we sliced them for dinner that night. And she grew her own radishes, she grew her own lettuce, just like she always did growing up as a child. And zucchini, she only would put in 4 zucchini plants, always figuring that, you know, that would get us enough. But instead what it did, tons of zucchini. So we also ended up making a lot of zucchini bread. And I will be showing you the recipe for that eventually. And we had casseroles. We had tuna casserole. We had, once a week she would do her fried chicken with mashed potatoes, and she would make a country milk gravy to go with it. And again, really stick to your rib food, but about as good as you can get anywhere. I challenge anybody to get better chicken. And she raised her chickens too. Yes, Frumpy, welcome back. And we were talking about banjo again. As I started talking about growing up on the farm in summer times with my grandmother, it switched over to banjos right on cue. So you can see how this has actually changed in texture now. You can see that the color is different. You can see that it's moving more viscous. It is still liquid, but it now coats the back of a spoon. And I am going to have to have my husband taste this. Do you taste flour? Okay, not quite done yet. It tastes a little bit floury. This is why it's important to taste. You taste your ingredients all along. You do it for, use your senses in anything you cook. You need to use your eyes first. Does the produce, does the meat, does it have the right color? Does it have the right appearance? Do you see any kind of discoloration? Do you see? And then you need to add in texture. You need to feel the vegetables. If you didn't know, celery should not flex. It's not something that's wobbly. And neither should cucumbers, neither should zucchini. None of these vegetables are meant to be wobbly at all. If you see that, they're starting to get old, they're starting to get dehydrated, and you don't want that. Double check your food always. Make sure that you don't see any signs of spoilage, no dark spots, no soft spots, no spots with fuzz. Very few produce starts out fuzzy, so just reject those. And same thing with the sense of smell. Does this smell, if you're talking about vegetables, does it smell like a fresh vegetable? Does it smell kind of grassy? Does it smell like the base vegetable should? Does it smell like a zucchini should? Is there any strange sweetness to the smell? Because rot often comes with a sense of sweetness before it really goes to town. Same thing with your meat. Make sure that your meat, if it's a red meat, make sure the meat is red. And rinse the blood off, because if it's sat in blood for a little while, the blood will probably smell a little funny. Rinse the blood off, and at that point smell the meat and see if it once more just smells like a fresh piece of meat should. And I hope you can all see, it's pretty clear to me, maybe not to you all, that this has all changed to a deeper brown. You can see it is bubbling. And I'm going to get a new spoon. And as you can see now as I do this, that is coating the spoon. That's bare minimum gravy right there. And let's have another taste test. Needs salt, but other than that. Can you bring me the salt shaker from the refrigerator or from the kitchen? Yeah, I know. So I'm going to add about a quarter to a half a teaspoon of salt to this. And I'm doing that because this is actually unsalted gravy. The difference being a 32-ounce container of broth from even a low sodium one is about 3,200 milligrams of sodium in the entire container. Unsalted, it is 65 per cup. So, yeah, you're looking more like 200 and maybe 300 milligrams of sodium in the entire container instead of thousands. So that plays it up here. And I declare this gravy done. So, at this point we have gravy that is finished. And we have a movie magic style, ow! I need to get this power cord out of there. And it is very, very, very hot. Okay, and I need a new scoop because the other one went over the edge of the table. Of course it did. Alright, it is time to plate this bad boy up. So we have our gravy, which I am moving back out of screen. And we have our beautiful blue plate. And we have a casserole, which has come out of the oven, movie magic style, after having cooked for an hour. And as I said, you can serve this with more vegetables on the side. You can serve it with less vegetables, whatever you have. A lot of this also freezes beautifully, which is always very important when you're talking about some kind of casserole. And I apologize again for my production values. It will get better as we go along. When I get a second camera, for instance. Okay, so here is a nice large portion of the stuffing with hamburger in it. You can see the onions, you can see the celery, you see nice big pieces of broccoli. And this was cooked for an hour. And now comes the best part, actually ladling gravy over it. So here we go. We need to be generous with the gravy because, let's be honest, half of the fun of stuffing is the gravy. And here we have a beautiful plate of food. You can see all of the large bits of vegetables in it. And at this point, I take this lovely piece of art and I hand it to my husband so that he can taste it. Has a bit of crunch in it from the vegetables that are al dente rather than cooked completely through. As I said, if you prefer your gravy or your stuffing to be softer, you just want to pre-cook. You just want to pre-cook those vegetables a bit in butter and then put them in. Sweat out the onions to a point of translucency instead of putting them in raw, and cook your celery that way as well. And now this is what we have. We have a we have a casserole now that is done, and I will show that to you. Oy, heavy. Here is the finished casserole that I movie magicked earlier, and it has a lot of vegetables in it. It has big chunks of meat. I hope you can see the large chunks of meat in there. And serve it with mashed potatoes or just a side salad. Serve it as it is by the bowl or the plate. And yeah, this is one of these casseroles. I have two now, so if you have any questions about the recipe, it is posted in my Discord in screen recipes. Pictures will be coming up for this, and I really wish you guys could taste this. It has the beauty of the sage and the big pieces of beef in it. The stuffing is tender without being sopping. It's not a wet stuffing. It is instead just a very tender, moist stuffing. A little bit of crunch around the edges, a little bit of crunch to the bread cubes, and of course the vegetables that we put in here raw. I used a frozen broccoli, but you could use fresh. Fresh is obviously better. And thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate your viewership. I appreciate all of your follows, and it's just really very heartwarming to be embraced this way. Saturday is our next stream. It will be noon Pacific. That seems to be a good time on Saturday for my mods and for myself. And we will vary the other times during the week that we need to try to make it a little easier on you all. If you can't make the stream, please check out the VOD, and I will make sure those are available in other locations once they're taken down by Twitch after 2 weeks. Like I said, I'm going to be making baked omelets on Saturday, so I hope to see you all there. Please enjoy this recipe. Like I said, whatever vegetable you have on hand, throw it in. It changes the complexity a little bit in flavor, but that's one of the ways you can vary it so it doesn't become a stale recipe. Thank you all for coming. Love you all. Bye-bye.
The app crashed on us, boys. Sorry. Apologize. Big apologies, sorry. When you guys have a chain, will you rename all the streets you set up on? Yeah, what?